Okay, as I start recording this video, we are the 30th of June 2023, and I intend to talk about chemistry and consciousness and civic virtue, and share some thoughts. I've showed two of my documents as an introduction. I just summarize briefly what I intend to talk about. I prepared this video, I wrote down my thoughts, then I organized a little bit. So I intend to talk about daily life briefly, psychology and civic virtue, reading books, the chemistry of consciousness. I will explain what I mean. Logic, physics, chemistry, the logic of chemistry, and civic virtue and politics. Yeah. And morality, the difference between morality and ethics. Yeah. So I have a few sheets of paper on which I've written some thoughts that I've had a few days ago, but which are in the continuity of my intellectual development. So I'll put the structure of the video in the description below. About daily life. I speak here as a singular individual. In order to be psychologically balanced, I need to have a balanced daily life, which means for me to have a little bit of physical work, doing a little bit of exercise each day. I am physically disabled partly, so I cannot do running, but to go outside to walk, to do a little bit of exercise, at least 20 or 30 minutes each day, just for the sake of exercising a little bit and being physically active, to the limited extent of my physical capabilities. Intellectual work, this is what I do most of the day, namely to think, to reflect, to organize, to order my ideas. Reading, in order to gather information, follow the news, the daily tasks, hygiene, kitchen, clean the room, household management, etc., etc., and civic participation, participate in local charities, encourage small businesses, being ecologically active, one might say. So yeah, I need to have at least a little bit of each aspect in my day-to-day life in order to be stable. Yeah, because for a very long time in my life, here I speak as an empirical individual, I used to be heavily focused on reading and intellectual endeavors, one might say, and I tended to forget the more bland, the more ordinary, the more routine aspect of daily life. But since I have become more autonomous, more independent, it has helped me a lot to grow up psychologically, to mature, etc., etc. Also, I wrote, specialization leads to myopia. Specialization is good because it increases economic productivity. The division of labor is the foundation of civilization, one might say, as Mises would say. But if you are too narrow-minded, you develop short-sightedness. You are focused only on your tiny parcel, aspect, window of reality, and you tend to not be able to see the whole. That's why to have a general view is important, and I started the video by showing the document which shows the totality of society, to know or to be aware of at least the fundamental basic knowledge of all the topics which constitute a society is important. Yeah. Then about UPS, I wrote, me as a singular individual, I am a singular. My particularity in terms of interest, my most intense particularity is the European world, one might say. Not continental Europe, but anthropological Europeans. And my universality is scientific and following the news. So I try to balance my daily routine by taking care of myself as a singular individual, my daily routine, one might say, to be psychologically balanced. I am interested in following the contents which revolve around topics of interest for Europeans, one might say, but also have my scientific view, which is by its very nature universal, namely valid for all. A scientific truth is the same for all rational agents, and I follow the news which talk about the world which is common to all. We all live in the same world, governed by the same laws. Yeah, and I wrote little efforts, if they are constant and if they are repeated thoroughly, they can lead, and indeed they do lead, to great achievements, one might say. Yeah. And also I wrote about psychology. I recently watched a video by Dutton about, titled, "Why are Autistics attracted both to conservatism and libertarianism?" And this is a great video, like a lot of his videos, but it has helped me a lot because it has made me become aware that my political views, one might say, are heavily influenced by my psychology, which I was aware of, but yeah, Mr. Dutton, Edward Dutton, understands me very well. Yeah. So autistic people who are highly intelligent, apparently they tend to be attracted by conservative and libertarian politics, and that's my case. So yeah, I already knew this, but this video is really great. Yeah. Also, a lot of my time is dedicated to reading books. What I do when I read books is first a brief overview, the title, the table of contents, the index, the bibliography, the introduction, the conclusion, etc., to briefly inspect the book. Then I read the book briefly from start to finish. It can take many days sometimes, while underlying the important words. Then I copy the important words whenever I read a book, the important words, a book worthy of being thoroughly read, the important words on an Excel file, a computer file, and I categorize and classify, and then I reread the book more thoroughly while paying attention to the definition of the words that I underlined. It's very useful. I've started doing this for a few months now. It's really useful when you read a book to outline, underline the important words and their meaning, and paying attention to the important words in a book, and rereading the book while having this in mind. It tremendously increases the ability to understand and store knowledge. And once you have developing the habit of doing this, you can use the words and the definitions and the concepts in ordinary sense of one book or one field of knowledge into another, and you can create connections and links. Yeah. Also, I wrote, if I had to recommend at this moment, but these are great books, a list of a few books which would contain the greatest amount of information in the smallest quantity of pages, one might say. I would say How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler, Troublesome Inheritance by Nicholas Wade, Making Sense of Race by Edward Dutton, The Bell Curve by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, and The Fed by Ron Paul, How to Think About the Economy by Per Bylund. Yeah, I've listed these 6 books very briefly. I haven't thoroughly thought about it, but these books, each of them contains a tremendous amount of information. They are very enlightening, and yeah, so I can only recommend. Yeah, so now it's been more than 12 minutes. Now I can talk about the chemistry of consciousness. I intend to talk about chemistry and the development of consciousness because I have been studying the sciences, and I continue to do so a little bit each day, and connecting the dots using the concepts of one field, one scientific field, to enlighten the other is really great. That's why having a general view, an overall view, is important. So, very briefly, chemistry is the science of the transformations of matter by chemical reactions. Atoms, or more frequently molecules, collide, and if the conditions are adequate, a chemical reaction follows, and the substances, the chemical compounds or the chemical substances are transformed. They create connections or disconnection, and they are transformed into new substances. New molecules are being formed. Yeah. And I wrote, in the realm of consciousness, when you collide with either an event or an ideology or a book, there is a likelihood that you might be transformed yourself, and the process of the development of consciousness, which in the language of German metaphysics is called the phenomenology of spirit, the Phenomenologie des Geistes, not the book but the process, is a chemical process, in a way, an alchemical process, which consists in transforming the content of consciousness, the worldview, the data stored in the mind of those who go through the process, and not only the data, but the tools with which they think about the world, the Weltanschauung. And this process, which personally I started unconsciously the process almost 7 years ago, what they call the red pill, it's a chemical or an alchemical process of the transformation, the development, the evolution of consciousness. And here I intend in this video to make analogies with chemistry, and I just listed a few examples. What happens in the 21st century with the advent of the internet is that the totality of world knowledge is made accessible in real time on the internet. What I showed at the beginning of the video is my document, which shows the totality. It's simplified, it can be improved, but I haven't modified this document for many months, but I am working to improve. But as of now, this is the greatest, I will show the document, the greatest balance in terms of, it contains the greatest amount of information to help think systematically about a society in the shortest, the smallest extension of space, one might say. It contains an enormous amount of information which enable to think clearly about a society. Yeah. A human society with its institutions. It contains an enormous amount of information. Yeah. It's the result of months, years, decades of unconscious or conscious work. Yeah. And here I list examples. The trends in demographics and migrations by being confronted with a lot of people who are different on many regards, ethnically, culturally, religiously, sometimes linguistically, let us say culturally, in the broader sense, it can create, and very often it does, and this is what happens, what has been happening, and what continues to happen in the 21st century, predominantly in the Western world, because of the demographic changes which have occurred over the past few decades and which still occur. Native Westerners, who are overwhelmingly white people, are confronted on their own historical territory by others, and it can create, and a lot of time it does among the younger generation, a transformation of consciousness. And here I've listed example. The changes in demographics, they lead to a revival of patriotism. That's a dialectical movement being confronted or being encountering an other which is really different culturally, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, and then it can lead to economic differences and differences of customs and behavior, etc. It dialectically brings about a retreat towards oneself, and by encountering the other, one discovers or rediscovers the self. Encountering an other makes you become aware of the other, but it also makes you become aware of yourself in relation to this other. So the other is the one who enables you to become conscious of yourself. Yeah. It's a psychological trend, but it happens politically as well. Yeah, and here I've listed a few examples. So yeah, immigration and the changes of demographics lead dialectically to a revival of patriotism. And if I had to illustrate, we see this, we've seen this for the past many years, and we continue to see this every day in political results in Europe, Northern America, etc. There is a revival of patriotism. This is what happens. Yeah. Another example, being confronted by radical feminists can lead, and sometimes does lead, to a shift towards masculinity movements or micto movements. So people who are not conscious of gender dynamics, if they encounter really the radical modern forms of feminism, sometimes they are drawn towards masculinity trends, Andrew Tate, the micto movement, holotomacy, etc., etc. This is an illustration of, in a way, a chemical, one might say, a chemical reaction, because it transforms, here, from the perspective of males, it transforms the males, but sometimes it transforms the women as well. Either they are attracted by men who try to become masculine in the modern form of emphasis on really masculinity as exemplified by some of the people that I've listed, or they can be repelled. They can find, some women find this attractive, some find this repulsive. That's the denunciation of toxic masculinity. So in a way it's a chemical interaction. The warfare state that has developed in a lot of Western countries, the state takes the money from the citizen to finance the welfare state, namely redistribution to sometimes the underclass or the bureaucrats in the name of justice or whatever, or to finance wars and standing armies abroad. When people see the trick, they switch towards libertarianism. Yeah, this is what happened. That's why libertarianism will continue to attract more and more people, because more and more people will be fed up, one might say, with the excesses of welfare redistribution and the foreign policies of countries. So yeah, this is what happened with someone like Ron Paul, the Mises Institute, etc., etc. The problems of inflation, when consciousness, the consciousness of average people encounters the problem of inflation with the access to the modern means of communication and information, their consciousness, if they are interested and if they have the ability, the time to dedicate, etc., will be transformed, because they will become aware of the criticism of the Fed by the libertarians and of central banking. So by encountering an other, it can be for good or for bad, but by encountering another, the consciousness of those who collide, to use the vocabulary of chemical reactions, who collide with another substance, one might say, it transforms them. Yeah. The crimes perpetrated by immigrant populations can lead to, and actually sometimes, a lot of time do lead to, an increase in racism among, here I talk about the Western world, among the native population. This is what happens. When people become aware of the JQ, it can lead, and sometimes does lead to, a revival of, well, ideologies which are not necessarily friendly towards the JQ, one might say. The constant failures of the public services like school, security, infrastructures, the corruption of politicians, the inefficiency of the bureaucracy. When people realize this, when they become aware of the problem, their consciousness is transformed, and they want more federalism, less bureaucracy, more liberties, more free market, etc., etc. That's a dialectical interaction. Yeah. The slow death of Europe, not the continent, but the people and the civilization, leads to a revival of the interest for European culture. This is the unconscious driving force underlying what people call the red pill. For a lot of people, not only because there are other aspects like women, central banking, which are more universal, but yeah. So that's a dialectics, a reciprocal interaction of opposites mutually generating one another. That's reciprocal determination. And the trend in chemistry, when substances collide and react, when there are chemical reactions and both are transformed, is a search for balance, for chemical balance and stability. Yeah. Yeah. And I wrote, those who chemically evolve spiritually, precisely, I will explain what this means. Those whose consciousness evolves, those who follow the red pill, namely who encounter a lot of different ideas and who react by being confronted by these ideas, either by agreeing or disagreeing, by retreating into oneself or opening up to new perspectives. The reactions can be different, like in chemistry, different atoms, different molecules react differently with one another, depending on the substances, but also depending on the conditions, heat, temperature, light, etc., etc., pressure, etc. I wrote, when you incorporate the other within yourself, intellectually, spiritually, that's called idealization. It doesn't mean the naive sense, but to idealize means to negate while preserving, to incorporate in your mind. When you incorporate otherness within yourself, every time that you encounter otherness, for instance, here about the Mictos and the feminists, when you discover the modern feminist ideology, you understand, if you study, you understand the feminist ideology, and then if you become a Micto, you understand the Micto philosophy, so you incorporate both, you understand the development of consciousness in women and in males, in females and males, men and women. And when you have these kind of intellectual experiences, you become very heavy and very dense because you incorporate a lot of viewpoints in your mind. That's why those who travel the most thoroughly, the most consistently, the further or the furthest away, the more consistently and for the most intensely, they become very dense and very heavy intellectually because they incorporate a lot of intellectual perspectives in their mind. Yeah, and I wrote, those who begin as leftists in the modern world, in the 21st century, in the Western world, because this is what the starting point is, when you go out of when you leave the educational system, you have been programmed to be a cosmopolitan leftist. Yeah. If you continue into politics, the universities, the mainstream media, that's the dominant ideology. So those who leave this starting point to wander intellectually, to travel, and who turn towards the right, this happens a lot. They become spiritual precisely because they experience both sides. That's spirituality, detachment, and reincorporation, and a separation which enables to have the consciousness, the perception of an object, not necessarily physically, it can be intellectual, to consider. It enables development and growth, and yeah. I wrote, I have become very rich intellectually, one might say, because I have traveled a lot the red pill path. This is what I've been talking about directly or indirectly in most of my videos for the past many months, even many years. So I will not list all the steps, but I've realized by thinking about this that I possess more determinations, intellectual perspective than even a lot of very intelligent, very red-pilled people, because I have the perspective of French socialism, Marxism, because modern France has a strong tradition of Marxism, sociology, because it's trendy in France and because I studied sociology as a student many years ago, philosophy, because I have been studying formal philosophy on my own, ecology, because I've been interested in this for many years, continental European culture. I have acquired a continental classical European culture, not full, not perfect, not thorough, etc., but I have a broad culture about Europe, more widened, more broader than most people. I have knowledge of Islam in the perspective of the modern West, the presence of Islam in modern Western Europe, which the Americans, for instance, or even the Canadians don't, or at least not as extensively as the Germans, the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, and even the English do. And also I speak French, English, a little bit of German in a rusty way, but I do nonetheless. And I studied a little bit of Greek and Latin many years ago. So I have not thorough, but I have perspective on these topics, while also having become aware of what I call Anglo-Saxon sociobiology, people like Edward Dutton, Richard Lynn, Philip J. Rushton, etc. Helmut Nyborg, he's a Dane, but he's been influenced by the previously mentioned people like Rushton and Richard Lynn. I have the perspective of German metaphysics, because I've studied this a lot, of Austrian economics, and also paganism and Christianity. So, plus the other topics, but I have become very rich intellectually because I have really a lot of viewpoints, more than a lot of people. And I wrote the process of the development of consciousness in the 21st century with the availability of knowledge on the internet, what you will call the red pill, is driven consciously or unconsciously by either a thirst for knowledge, a quest for understanding, a search for truth, a fear of replacement, one might say. This is the driving force which begins the process for a lot of people, either consciously or unconsciously. It can be an ambition, a search for status, or a desire for liberty, or it can be all the aforementioned aspects. This is what negativity, a lack, a need, a desire, is what drives the process. That's why it affects predominantly white people, because there are the socio-economic reason, because you have to have access to the internet and have hobbies or leisure to be able to gather knowledge. Not all people in the world can do that, obviously. But also there is the fear of being replaced, not as individuals, although it can be, but the long-term prospect of the erasure of the European people and Western civilization, and no other people, maybe in Tibet, but other than that, no other people faces the prospect of a long-term, or a short and long-term, short here it means a few decades, a couple of centuries in the chronological perspective. No other people on this planet is in danger of being erased. That's why that's one of the most powerful driving forces which lead the development of ideas, that which we see every day in publications, videos, think tanks, political parties, etc. I explain what happens. Now about I will briefly talk about logic. I will not make a thorough lecture about logic, but the logic of being, quality, quantity, measure, these are the most simple determination of the mind within the sphere of ontology, one might say. I simplify. Quality. Quality is one with being. In other words, whatever is what it is through its quality. Here it doesn't mean good quality or bad quality. We are not judging the quality of whatever we're talking about. We're judging the ontological reality of objects. What are objects? Objects are what they are through their quality. This is a pair of glasses. To qualify this object, here it's a subjective, to predicate a subjective thought determination to an external object. This is a pair of glasses. To qualify means to answer the question what. What is it? What is requires that determinations be given, and to determine means to qualify. Yeah. So this is the first moment of being. Whatever is what it is through its quality. If something, whatever it may be, if something loses its quality, it ceases to be what it is. If something loses its quality, it no longer is what it is. And here, what I say, but if a movie franchise start producing bad movies, it loses its quality, but it's still a movie franchise. When I say yes, but here the quality is improper because actually it's a quantity, namely the quality in terms of aesthetic value or entertainment value decreases. Here that's a quantitative determination, but a bad movie from a good quality movie franchise, it will not make the franchise cease to be what it is, except if they produce a lot of bad movies, they will go bankrupt, and yeah, but that's a change of measure. But yeah, so it's not usually, but things cease to be what they are when they lose their quality. That's why formulated differently, quality is one with being. Quantity, on the other hand, is indifferent to being. Quality is one with being. Whatever is what it is through its quality. But quantity is indifferent to being, which means that the quantity of something, whatever, can change, and the something whose quantity changes will not cease to be what it is. It will not lose its ontological determinacy if the quantity changes. That's why quantity is indifferent to being. Something can increase or decrease, intensify or extend, and it will not cease to be what it is. A house, a field, a forest, a village can increase quantitatively, they can change their quantitative determinacy, they will not cease to be what they are. Human beings can grow in size, they will still be human. You can increase the quantity of water in a water bottle, it will not cease to be what it is. You can increase the size of a car, it will not cease to be what it is, etc. So it works for everything because it's at the ontological basis of everything. The quantity is the ontological determinacy which can change without affecting the being of whatever is being quantitatively modified. Here I speak like a boring German philosopher, but there comes a moment when the quantitative change, which at first seemed indifferent, and actually was indifferent to the being of whatever was being quantitatively modified, there comes a moment when this quantitative change, which was indifferent to being, when a quantitative change will bring about a qualitative change, and something will cease to be what it was through a quantitative change. So quantity is supposed to be indifferent to being, but actually there is a moment which logically we call measure, when the quantity changes and it changes the quality. And this qualitative quantity or this quantitative quality is that which we call measure. Yeah, so actually that's the truth of being. Things are not what they are only through their quality. They are not what they are only through their quantity. They are what they are through their measure. Yeah. If you add 100 inhabitants to a village, it's still a village. You add 200 inhabitants, it's still a village. But there comes a moment, if you keep adding inhabitants, when it comes, I don't know, beyond 5,000 inhabitants, let us say arbitrarily, it is no longer a village, it becomes a small town. The quality changes. Yeah. It works for everything. Alcohol. In a beer you have, I don't know, 4 degrees of alcohol in a brewage. That's a beer usually. Not necessarily, but 4 degrees of alcohol. It's not very strong. If you increase 20 degrees, 40 degrees, that's vodka or scotch. It's still alcohol. But there comes a moment, if you keep increasing the quantitative amount of alcohol in a drink, it becomes poisonous, and medical alcohol is not for drink. 70% alcohol liquids, they are toxic. They are used only for medical purposes. That's an example. Yeah. A chemical, not a chemical, a physical example. Water between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius, it's liquid water. Below 0 degree, it becomes ice, and beyond 100 degrees, it becomes gas or vapor. So, if the quality is liquid, the quality of water can change quantitatively between 0 and 100 Celsius degrees, from 5 degree to 95 degree. The changes will be quantitative, they will be indifferent. Liquid water will be liquid, whether it's 5 degree hot or cold, 10, 35, 65, 80, 95. These quantitative differences are indifferent to the qualitative aspect of water as a liquid, but once the threshold is crossed between 99 and 100, it turns into gas. There's a change of measure. When it goes from 1 degree to 0, there's a qualitative change. Liquid becomes ice. Liquid becomes solid. Yeah. It works for pretty much everything. Yeah. So, now briefly about physics. I wrote, what is true of physics is true of chemistry and of the earth sciences and of biology. Chemistry, one might say, is a very complex form of physical interactions. They are qualitatively different, one might say, but it's still physically determined. The reaction between the atoms and the molecules, these are reactions between, most of the time, between the electrons who assemble or separate, and it is determined by physical laws. That's why there is quantum chemistry. Yeah. And biology is a very complex form of chemistry. Organism, biology, is a very complex form of chemistry. It's also qualitatively different. Here, that's a philosophical view. The Anglo-Saxons, who are reductionist and materialist, they would disagree. They would say, no, biology is just chemistry. It's complex chemistry, but it's just chemistry, and actually it's just physics. So that's really a materialist view. But actually, a philosophical view would say precisely that in the passage from physics and chemistry to biology, there is a qualitative change, that organism, that one cannot think mechanistically about organism. That's the view of Schelling, Hegel, and as far as not even Whitehead. Yeah. You cannot apply a mechanistic form of thinking to organism. That's the view of German idealism, one might say. Yeah. But nonetheless, what is true of physics and of chemistry is also true of biology. Namely, living organisms, they obey the laws of physics. They obey different laws which are more complex and qualitatively distinct, but they obey the laws of physics nonetheless. They are determined by gravity. They interact electromagnetically with other objects and from a gravitational standpoint, etc., etc. Yeah. I wrote about density in physics. Here I illustrate the importance of studying all the fields of science to make connections. Density is the relationship between the quantity of matter in a given volume 1 kilogram of lead and 1 kilogram of cotton or paper, they weigh the same weight, precisely 1 kilogram, but one is much more dense. Namely, the volume of 1 kilogram of lead is much more small, it's more dense than 1 kilogram of cotton. Except if it's hard pressed, but actually no, it's much more dense. Yeah. Yeah. So density means a great amount, in a case of chemistry, atoms or molecules in a given volume, which is a geometrical determination. And I wrote, profound thinkers and heavyweight intellectuals are dense thinkers, one might say. And the genius of great thinkers, especially the Germans, here I wrote a praise for Nietzsche, especially, but also Hegel, but especially Nietzsche. I will begin with Hegel. Hegel is a very dense thinker because the amount, here I speak in ordinary language, the amount of thoughts which are contained in some of the sentences of Hegel, it's very, very dense because it contains an incredible amount of profound, sometimes mind-blowing thoughts in a few sentences. That's the mark of real geniuses in philosophy, the ability to concentrate complex, enlightening, brilliant thoughts in a small amount of words or sentences or pages in the case of books. So here I give an anecdote. When I discovered the thought of Hegel more than 5 years ago, I was struck, unstuck, because of the density of his thoughts. Every page was a treasure of an infinite amount of intellectual brilliance, because it's very dense. Not everywhere, but the preface is very dense. Yeah. And here, someone like Nietzsche, a lot of time I laugh about Nietzsche. I do not laugh about him, but I use Nietzsche as a comical relief because existence can be difficult. But if I had to talk about Nietzsche more seriously, Nietzsche really is a genius because he has the ability to express very profound, very complex, very interesting, very deep thoughts in a poetic way, a lot of times, but also in a very dense way. He doesn't, Nietzsche, if we compare Nietzsche to Kant or Hegel or other German metaphysicians like Schelling or Fichte or Leibniz or Heidegger, Nietzsche is not as rigorous and systematic, one might say, obviously, but in a way he manages to condense, to compress, to compact, to reduce the already infinitely complex and extremely dense thoughts of other Germans, or not necessarily Germans, but other great thinkers, but in an even more dense way and with a poetic, aesthetic expression. That's really, here, I'm serious, Nietzsche, some of his views, they can be a little bit controversial, sometimes it can be comical or excessive, etc. But if we had to judge Nietzsche properly, when he's at his best, he really is a genius of density. Yeah, Nietzsche is the genius of density, and he praises himself. Somewhere he says, my purpose is to express in I don't know exactly, but he said in a few sentences what others take pages and pages to express. But actually he lives up to his own expectation and his own standards, because some of the thoughts of Nietzsche, they are very profound, very deep, very brilliant, very dense. A lot of great philosophers have this ability to produce dense thought, but Nietzsche, he does this consistently. That's why Nietzsche, in a way, he has the verbal brilliance, the aesthetic appeal of a poet, the depth and insight of a philosopher, the temper of a revolutionary, one might say. He's really a genius. Yeah. The density is what I would associate with Nietzsche. There are other qualities, but yeah. Another remark about philosophical books, great philosophical books, they can be very thick, very heavy in terms of pages, but they contain, even if it's many hundreds or thousands of pages, they contain an enormous amount of thoughts expressed in an abstract way, but it's like the universe is being condensed, the density of the universe is being gathered in great philosophical books. Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, etc. These authors, they are not dense in ordinary sense, in a sense that they take many dozens or hundreds of pages to express their ideas, but the ideas that they express, they are infinitely complex, but in a good way. They manage to ask and sometimes answer the most profound question in a rigorous and systematic way, while thinking clearly and rigorously. That's why great philosophical books, they are of an infinite wealth. And the great religious books, especially the great passages in a great religious books, they are also very dense because they contain a lot of sometimes ethical or moral or spiritual insights in a very short amount of pages. There are a lot of passages in the Bible which are extremely dense. Not all of them, but there are some passages which are extremely dense because they express in a few pages extremely profound thoughts. Yeah, it's the case with most religious books, but yeah. Yeah, so that was about density, which is, at first, it's a category from physics, but actually it can be applied to pretty much everything, because in a physical perspective, what is true of physics is true of everything which derives from physics. Yeah. Yeah. Here briefly about chemistry. One of the questions of chemistry, very simplified, is how do substances, chemical substances, material compounds, when I say how do they transform into other substances? It requires a contact between substances and a reaction. Here I've listed a few examples from chemistry book. When a match is being lit, that's a chemical reaction. When wine turns to vinegar, that's another example. When an effervescent tablet is put into water, that's another example. Yeah, but when water and sugar are mixed together, that's not a chemical transformation, it's just physical. And when water freezes or is being vaporized, or when substances are just mixed, these are not chemical transformation but physical ones, because no new substances are being produced, and there are no reactions, no chemical reactions. Yeah. Yeah. adding sugar to water, that's just a mixture. It's not a chemical change. Not like wine turning to vinegar, yeah, or yeah. So why are there reactions, chemical reactions sometimes, under certain conditions? Why are there fast and slow reactions? It depends on the conditions, the pressure, the speed, the energy, the light, the heat, other determinations. Yeah. And here I will briefly talk about the logic of atoms and chemistry. I had the Mendeleev table, but I will not go pick it up now, but yeah. The logic of atoms and chemistry. So yeah, I try to connect, to illustrate very simply fundamental determination of chemistry with the use of logic. It's not very complex, but it's just to illustrate the various atoms. They are qualitatively different. Hydrogen, helium, iron, nitrogen, gold, silver, etc., etc. They are oxygen, etc. They are qualitatively different. That's why they have different chemical properties. The various atoms which are listed and classified in the table of Mendeleev, they are qualitatively different, but actually their qualitative differences on a physical level, they are quantitative differences. What differentiates the various atoms classified, which are actually the atoms which exist in nature, but which are classified in the periodical table of Mendeleev, these are quantitative differences. The differences in the number of protons and neutrons and electrons, this is what determines the qualitative differences between the various atoms. Yeah. Yeah. I wrote that reactions, I just copied interesting perspectives from a book about chemistry. A reaction means a redistribution of atoms in a state of association different from the initial state. So in chemistry, bonds are being formed, bonds are being broken, connections, chemical bonds between the various atoms and the various molecules. Yeah, so chemistry is about association and disassociation. Yeah. And here, an example of logical categories in the physical and chemical world. The protons, which are the particles in the nucleus of atoms, they have a positive charge. The electrons, they have a negative charge. They attract one another, one might say, like objects with a mass attract one another through gravitation. But there's also repulsion. Two negative charges repel one another, usually. The electrons, they can bond together as well, but the reason why we do not we do not go through objects is because there is electromagnetic repulsion. This is what makes the world stable. We do not sink into the soil or go through the walls because there is contact, which at the atomic level is repulsion between the electrons of the body or any object and the electrons of the object which it encounters. The reason why we stand on the ground is because of electromagnetic repulsion. Yeah, so positive, negative, attraction, repulsion. The number of protons in the nucleus of atoms determines the nature of the element. Yeah, and the number and the position of external electrons determine the chemical properties of atoms. So the chemical properties which on our level, in terms of perception, these are the chemical differences which are qualitative, which can be experienced through touch, sight, smell, taste, etc. On a microscopic level, the qualitative differences between the various objects in terms of taste, smell, color, etc., etc., they are quantitatively determined. Namely, these are the number of external electrons which determine which atom or which molecules composed of whatever atoms can interact with one another. So the qualitatively different building blocks of reality, that which we call the atoms, they are quantitatively different and their interactions are quantitatively determined. Yeah, so density, toughness, impenetrability, etc., etc. These are examples of qualities of objects, physical objects, but which are quantitatively determined. I wrote the electrons. That's the rule of chemistry. They pair bond. Single electrons, they seek for a mate. So there is love, chemical romance on a chemical level. The electrons, when they are single, they seek a partner. This is what we call covalent bonds. Bonded states. When two single electrons, when they unite together, when they associate, usually it brings about a more stable state than single state. So here it is true at the level of chemistry, but actually on the level of society, when there are more marriages and more stable and long-lasting marriages, society tends to be more stable. Satoshi Kanazawa, Japanese sociobiologist, explained that one of the reasons why a significantly important proportion of young Muslim males compared to other groups perpetrate sometimes acts of violence, it can be partly explained statistically by the fact that a lot of them are single males. So a lot of acts of violence are perpetrated by single males. When males find, it can be more or less empirically verified, when they find a partner, a female partner, and when they marry, or when they find stable relationship, they are much less inclined towards violence. So marriage is a means, here that's anthropology. Monogamy has some downturns from a genetic standpoint, because in a monogamous marriage structure, the best males genetically usually only have children with one female partner, whereas in polygamous society, those who carry the best genes, the male with the best, the most attractive, the most efficient, the most evolutionarily successful and desirable genes, they can spread their genes with many females. In polygamous society, the alpha males, the best males, they have access to a lot of females, so they can have a lot more offspring than if they are constrained by society and monogamous forms of bonding to have only one partner and eventually a mistress, but they are not supposed to have children with the mistress. But the monogamous institution of marriage enables the lower status males to have a more easy access to females. So more people, normally, usually in a society with strong monogamous marriage institutions, more males are supposed to have access to sex and marriage, which is supposed to bring about a lot more stability, because males, when they have access to a marriage partner, they are much less frustrated, and they tend to bring a lot less disturbance to society. That's why it's a hypothesis. Maybe it has been, I know that some scientists have talked about this, but it might partly explain the civilizing role of Christianity. Not only Christianity, but it can explain why it brings a lot of stability, because a society with a strong monogamous institution of marriage, it tends to bring about stability because it enables more males to have access to marriage, because precisely the top males are limited and restricted to one partner, they are supposed to, so they cannot monopolize many females. That's why females are more evenly distributed among more broader range of males. So yeah, there are good aspects. It brings societal stability. Bad aspects from a genetic perspective is that the best genes have a lower frequency of reproductive multiplication, one might say, because it limits, monogamy limits the ability of the best males to have many offspring with more females. Yeah, but it brings the counterpart is that, like in chemistry, when there are bonds, it brings about a lot more stability. And from a chemical standpoint, entering the bonding stage brings about a loss of energy and a release of heat, translated into romance and marriage. The loss of energy is that the males, when they find a female partner to marry, usually they become less frustrated and less disturbing for society. And the release of heat, well, I will not, I don't need to illustrate, I guess, but maybe they call it the honeymoon, I don't know. That's a joke. No, but actually it's very serious. On the level of atoms, when electrons find covalent bonds, when they pair bond, when they mate with other electrons, they form relationship, which brings about more stability and less energy. So yeah. And I wrote on a chemical level, heat or light sometimes produces the breaking of bonds. And here, to illustrate in society, hot women, here it's a play on words, but actually it's partly true nonetheless. Hot women, younger women who are hot and attractive, they have a tendency indirectly to bring about the breaking of marriage, because the male, if he's successful, he might have the temptation to pick up a younger chick, a hotter chick, and to leave his aging wife. So that's an example of how heat can, that's a hot, we're talking about hot women, how they can unfortunately break bonds. That's why there are laws against cheating in marriages, and that's why men were supposed to honor their marriage contracts. So that's one of that's why the modern feminist ideology, everyone can mate with everyone else. It seems it has been advertised as a liberation for women, but actually, empirically, Mrs. Louise Perry wrote a book about this, Against the Sexual Revolution. Jordan Peterson talked about this. He interviewed her. Louise Perry, she's an English woman as far as I know. That actually, feminism, one of the consequences is it just that it has liberated women. Actually, no, it has enabled the most successful males to have a lot more sex with the most attractive females, because there was no longer restriction. So it has advantaged the most successful males, and it has brought a lot of problems for the least successful males, which comprise the majority of the masculine population. It's just mathematics, and a lot of women as well. So it has disrupted everything. It is being advertised as promoting the emancipation of women. Actually, it just promotes the interest of the alpha males yeah, because they can have sex with the most attractive females without social constraints and social restrictions. Yeah. The assemblies and bonding of atoms is determined by the number of external electrons. Also, the internal cohesion within a molecule depends on the force of attraction between the atoms which constitute the molecule. Translated in the realm of sociology, the cohesion of a society depends on the force of attraction between the members of society, which will be the atom, and the force of attraction in the realm of society. It's not a physical force, but it's the attraction of culture, customs, and religion. And in order for a society to have cohesion, there has to be bonds and connections and links of culture, customs, and or religion. They historically often have been linked with ethnic similarity, not always, but modern multicultural society are losing completely their cohesion because the forces of attraction between the various members are being completely eroded because people are really completely diverse, which can be a transitory stage towards assimilation, which is a determination that we find in biology, integration, when we say. But if people are encouraged to not bond together culturally, and if the institutional setting, economic, politics, legislation, promotes directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, the dissolution of society, society will lose its cohesion. Also, in chemistry, the atoms do not enjoy being too close to one another because of the repulsive forces between their electrons, and the favored geometry of molecules, I mean the assembly of atoms, the favored state of a molecule is the one which minimizes the interactions between the atoms which compose the molecule and enables the molecules to have the least amount of energy and therefore to be the most stable. This is a universal truth of chemistry. Molecules, they arrange, they order themselves, they organize themselves, one might say, by unconsciously, they do not have a conscious, but by trying to minimize the interactions between the atoms of the molecule so as to diminish and limit the amount of energy to find stability. And that's the chemical formulation, and it's true of chemistry. But in politics, that's the balance between the individual and the collective. A balanced society, in order for a society to be stable, the interactions between the individuals, which would be the atoms on a social level, in a way, they have to be minimum to avoid the negative interactions, while also being maximum to encourage social cohesion. And that's the political problem formulated chemically: how to gather together atoms, individuals, how to favor cohesion, the cohesion of society, while granting the greatest amount of liberty. Here it means not too much forced interactions between the individuals. So how to find a coherent, how to maintain and find stability in a society. It can be envisioned chemically. This is what politicians, I wouldn't say politicians, what political thinkers and political authority, not politicians, but historically what the political figures, the kings, the parliaments, the dictators, the tyrants, the bureaucrats, whatever, the kings in a lot of societies over the past few thousands of years, or the leaders, the figure of authority, the monarch, the prince, in a sense of the ruler with the political authority, what his role is usually supposed to bring justice, which is a means to have stability and balance within a society, which means to find the formula which enables the atoms, here that's a chemical view, but the individuals of a society to interact the most peacefully together to have the most stable society. It can be one goal. The problem is that too much stability can lead to stagnation. The example is historically the Chinese society, which has been over the millennia very stable, much more stable than most other society, which has brought about an enormous amount of benefits for the well-being. It has been difficult, like in all other society, but China for a very long time has been the most prosperous and the most maybe culturally developed society in the world for a long period of time, because it has found great stability. But the risk is that to stagnate, and Western societies under the golden age of Rome, it was prosperous and very stable, at least internally. In the early, the first couple of centuries in the Christian era, the empire was flourishing. That's the Pax Romana. Diverse people within the empire, when the empire was at its peak in terms of extension, they interacted with one another more or less peacefully, with prosperity, security within the border of the empire. That was the golden age. Here, as far as I know, up until the 18th century in Europe, no society had reached the level of prosperity and stability and peace that Rome enjoyed during the first couple of centuries of the empire. So that's a political formulation of a chemical problem that the interaction of the atoms are trying, that's one way of talking, trying to solve constantly. Molecules are seeking stability and balance by minimizing the negative interaction between the atoms which are comprised within the molecule. And on a chemical level, there is a struggle between a disorderly agitation of molecules and, on the other side, forces of cohesion which bring order and regularity. So on a material level, the material world is a constant struggle between tendencies toward agitation, which is increased by heat. The increase of heat brings about more disorder, and forces of cohesion, so the battle between chaos and order, that's one way of formulating this, happens constantly on a chemical level everywhere. And in the realm of politics, that's the struggle between the left and the right. The left would be the forces of disorder and agitation, and the right, classically, would be the forces of cohesion. Cohesion can bring stability, peace, balance, etc. But the negative consequences can be stagnation or even oppression in a way. If the order is too rigid, it can be oppressive. And agitation can bring about trouble, political trouble, instability, chaos, etc. These are the negative aspects, obviously, but the positive can be a flowering of idea, a boiling of idea. That's why historically the most productive era in European civilization, which is probably the 19th century, or ancient Greece, Athens in the classical age, but recently that's the 19th century, or the Renaissance. It was a boiling of idea. It was I wouldn't say leftist, but liberalism, which was the dominant ideology in Western Europe in the 19th century, was, when it flourished at the beginning, it was a leftist ideology. From our perspective, it would be very right-wing a couple of centuries later, but at the beginning of the 19th century, the liberals were on the left. The liberals, not the liberals of today, but the liberals, which we would call today the libertarians. Free market. The free market was a leftist ideology. Individualism was the ideology of the bourgeoisie, and here I know the French context. The bourgeoisie, in a way, was on the left. The right-wingers, these were the nobles, the aristocracy, the clergy, the king and the peasants, in a way, but especially the aristocracy, the landlords, the landowners, and the bourgeois, which had less wealth in the form of land and more in the form of economic circulating capital or cultural capital, when we say knowledge and businesses or financial stock, as opposed to the landowners, the landlords, which had land and titles of nobility. So that's the conflict between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was on the left, in a way. Today they would be on the far right, but back then they were on the left. So that's one of the good aspects of agitation, which can bring about. It can bring about innovation, progress, etc., etc. Yeah, but there has to be a balance, and the left and the right in politics, they are found at the level of chemical interactions. They are just, in a way, it can be interpreted this way. They are just a manifestation of chemical forces on a microscopic level. Here I wrote another example in politics. The left can be said, the modern left can be said to be psychologically rigid, political correctness, their sectarian belief, etc., while being loosened in terms of customs, sexuality, or social order. So the leftist, white leftists, they can be very rigid psychologically in a negative sense, while being completely loosened in customs and sexuality and etc. While the right usually can be very rigid in terms of behavior, but for the good, ethics, or in terms of hierarchy, reverence for the past, social distinction, etc., which the left criticizes, but actually it enables to bring stability and also progress. So the right can be very rigid ethically or in terms of hierarchy, but loosened as regards to the free market, to the market forces. So the right, they are rigid in terms of ethics and loosened, promiscuous, I might say, in terms of economics, etc. The left, they are psychologically rigid in terms of political correctness, finding fault with the right, indignation. I'm not sure that indignation means in English what it means in French, but complaining, how dare you? Yeah, how dare you? That's to be indignant, as I understand it, means how dare you. The left, they always say how dare you, etc. Yeah. So the leftists, they are sectarian and very rigid. They want to control through legislation behaviors, retrograde, reactionary behavior, etc. They are very intolerant, although they claim to care about tolerance. They are very intolerant, much more intolerant than the right-wingers, usually. And they are most of the time very loosened in terms of behavior. They tolerate any sort of loosened behavior, violence, sometimes dubious sexual behavior. And the right, in a way, they are very loosened, not all of them, but usually in terms of the free market. And here, an intelligent analysis, which have to pay homage to Monsieur Jean-Claude Michéa, who is a French intellectual who denounced this in an intelligent way. He explained that the right, over the past couple of centuries, has promoted free market principles while consistently denouncing the consequences that the free market brings to society in terms of customs. So Monsieur Michéa is some sort of a radical socialist critique of modern, what he calls liberalism, of the left and of the right, so left-wing liberals and free market right-wingers, because he accuses the right of complaining about the consequences in terms of morality of the principles that they defend in terms of economics. Namely, if you advocate free market, you advocate the right to produce and sell and trade all sorts of goods and services, which at some moment, considering how humans are wired psychologically, it will bring about the dissolution, in a way. It can bring about, and historically it has brought about, the dissolution of society in a lot of Western countries. And here that's the problem of the American conservatives. They are in favor of the free market, which in a way it's kind of good, but they complain about some of the consequences. Namely, if you... That's the problem of conservatives. Their principles are in contradiction with the consequences that they bring about. So they are a little bit schizophrenic, because to have really a virtuous society that the conservatives wish for would require restraints, constraints. But that's the problem of conservatives. And Monsieur Michéa noticed that the left, they pretend or they claim to struggle against the free market right-wingers, but actually most of the time they agree with them because there's some sort of an implicit agreement between the liberal left and the free market right to tolerate a lot of dubious behaviors. That was his criticism. It's partly relevant. That's the problem among libertarian circles, between the left-wing libertarians and the right-wing libertarians. A lot of libertarians on the left, they advertise libertarianism because they just want an ideology which enables them to behave in a loosened way, one might say. And the work of Hans Hermann Hoppe, consists in putting emphasis again on the primordial and most important principle, which is private property, namely the right to exclude, not to tolerate any sort of nonsense. So here that's an illustration. Cohesion, density, rigidity, these are psychological or social characteristics which actually are derived from physics and chemistry. Okay. Now I will talk about civic virtue and politics. So here I've been talking for more than an hour about chemistry. It's just to illustrate the interconnectedness. Here it's not very rigorous because I'm not an expert in all the fields of knowledge. It's very difficult to be knowledgeable in all the topics, but finding connections helps think more clearly. That's why it's interesting to study physics and chemistry and biology. First, it's interesting as such because it's interesting. It describes the universe. So it's interesting, but it can also be interesting beyond itself because it also enables to shed light on topics which at first sight might seem to be kind of indifferent, but actually no, they are not, because here that's a materialist perspective, but actually human beings, human interactions are the product of human brains, and human brains are the product of very complex form of chemistry. But here, Mises would say, and I tend to agree with him, that there is a qualitative change, namely, humans, they have purposeful behavior. They consciously and purposefully act, whereas chemical compounds, and even organic, non-human organic organism, no matter how complex they might be, they do not act purposefully, not consciously and purposefully. So that there's a, yeah, that's, yeah, but that's just to illustrate. So I wrote about civic virtue and politics. So here I drew, so we change kind of the topic, but it's important nonetheless, a distinction between what I call, these are just words, but I will develop the idea, what I call civic virtue versus what I call the bureaucratic structure or abstract law. It can be called otherwise, but I will illustrate. By bureaucratic structure, I mean having many legislative laws, many bureaucrats, many lawyers, and many judicial or legal interaction, many interactions between humans consciously mediated by law, formalism, social formalism, yeah. And here, the distinctions that can be drawn between this, that civic virtue puts an emphasis on to interpersonal relationships, whereas what I call bureaucratic structure puts an emphasis onto impersonal relationships. So there is on the one side interpersonal, intersubjective relationship, and on the other side it's impersonal. I mean, a bureaucracy is faceless. It's a structure with no personal interactions. Yeah. The positive and the negative aspects of civic virtue. Civic virtue, practicing civic virtue collectively, guarantees sovereignty, social life and social health, and also independence. To be sovereign and to be independent and to be free eventually as a political entity, whatever the size or the extent, but in order for a political entity to be free, and eventually if the citizens want to be free, they have to live in a politically free entity. I don't believe that there can be individual liberty without collective liberty. Yeah, but otherwise it's just living in the mountains or in the forest. It can happen, singular examples, singular cases of people who live like loners on a farm, off the grid as individuals. It can happen, or very small groups, but it's not it's not collectively feasible on the long term for a great number of people. If these are just individual initiatives, they are good, they should be promoted, encouraged, etc. But it cannot serve as a political view for a society. Yeah. So civic virtues, if it is consistently practiced by a great number of people within a political unit, a political entity, it guarantees sovereignty, social life and social health, and independence, which are the requirements for freedom. The negative aspect is that civic virtue is demanding, it requires efforts and constraints. The classical example, Sparta and Rome, and even Athens in a way, were very demanding. They required a lot of investment in terms of time and blood, one might say, on the part of their citizens. But the good part is that they were free. The price of freedom for the Athenians, the Spartans, and later the Romans during the Republican times, before the degeneracy of the Republic and then the Empire, Rome was free because it had a citizenry which was disciplined, dedicated, involved, etc., etc. Yeah, so the negative aspect of republicanism is the historical Western ideal that in order for a collective to be free, there has to be virtue on the part of the citizens, which is kind of opposed to the modern bourgeois view that precisely the bourgeois view says that virtue is not required on the part of the citizens, because here, that's an intelligent libertarian view, is that precisely if the state, in the name of the well-being of the community, begins to require virtue, it can be very vaguely defined, and then it opens the room for all sorts of interventionism and compulsion. Yeah, but nonetheless, the Republican ideal, the classical Republican ideal of Rome, Athens, Sparta, and later the free city-states in northern Italy, or even the Hanseatic League in northern Germany, or in the Netherlands, and then later in England, and then the United States of America and Switzerland, it requires participation on the part of the citizenry. It requires an independent, educated, willing, dedicated citizenry, which is costly in terms of investment and effort, of time, energy, dedication, etc. So that's the negative aspect. It's very demanding. Yeah. What I call the bureaucratic structure or abstract law, namely when social interactions are regulated mostly by law and do not require virtue. Well, when virtue comes down to the level of just a formal respect for the law, the law without the spirit, one might say, it can bring about liberty, individual liberty, emancipation of the individual, and efficiency. Namely, it can be very efficient when each person in a bourgeois society, for instance, can go about their own business, and the bureaucracy takes care of the formal functioning of society, providing the infrastructure, the legislative frame for enforcing contracts and facilitating trade, and etc., or even instruction. Yeah, it can bring about liberty, individual emancipation, and efficiency. But the negative aspect that we are witnessing a lot in the modern world is that it can bring about corruption, precisely because there are layers and layers of bureaucracy. So at each layer, people can take advantage through scheming, manipulation, etc. Corruption, parasitism, social disintegration, and over complexity, which lead to paralysis. So it can bring about efficiency, but also paralysis, because sometimes when the bureaucracy becomes too complex, just to do simple things, it requires layers and layers of bureaucracy, lots of laws, text, it's very complex. And social disintegration, precisely because that's the counterpart of granting liberty to the individual, is that in a society, if the people ceases to be virtuous, if every person becomes egotistical, precisely because the political frame enables or encourages this, the decline of republican virtue, civic participation, and ethical life, the decline is compensated by an increase in bureaucracy, which leads to corruption, parasitism, paralysis, etc., etc. That's why I wrote too many laws, as well as too few, but in the modern world that's more too many laws, leads to injustice, because justice, in terms of legislation, has to be the proper measure. When the laws in a country increase beyond a certain limit, it cannot be adequately quantified, but there comes a moment when there are too many laws, when the laws change constantly, when there are hundreds of laws or texts which are voted every year, the citizens, they do not have the capacity to even know about the constantly changing laws. So the sheer number of law when the codes of law and legislation, they become too thick and too extended and too huge, they become unjust for a question of measure. I mean, when there are too many laws, when it's too complex, even if they are well-intentioned, well-designed, it's not just because the people do not have the capability of grasping, understanding these laws, and they're constantly changing. That's one of the problems of capitalism and the development of technology, that in a capitalist society, the productive forces and the means of production and the innovation, the rate of innovation is so intense, the pace of the development of the economy is so intense, that the legislative aspect struggles to keep up with the constantly changing methods of production, which brings about here, that's partly Marxist, but it's kind of intelligent sometimes, the constantly changing relationship of production between the social actors. That's why there's a temptation to regulate, to legislate everything, because the pace of changes brought about by technology is too fast. An example is artificial intelligence, but the internet as well. It goes too fast for the legislator. Yeah. And also the logical determination of measure in terms of political systems. There are political systems where they are adapted to a given number of citizens or the size of a given territory, and if the number of citizens increases beyond a certain limit, the system, the political regime, is no longer adapted. Or if the territory is too vast, and here the example is that democracy, here Hegel knew this already, but democracy is adapted only to a tiny territory with a small population, because precisely a true democracy requires civic participation, and the citizens, they have to know each other, not personally all of them, but at least there has to be close connection. And Athens in the 5th century BCE, as far as I know, there were 50,000, broadly 50,000 citizens. There were many more inhabitants because there were the women, the foreigners and the slaves, but the citizens, they were limited in number. And already Plato and others denounced the dysfunctioning of democracy, but it was an aristocratic democracy and a quantitatively limited. And that's also why a country like Switzerland is maybe the most democratic country on earth, because it's a tiny country where people have power on a federal level, or used to have at least, and in a way they know each other. Although they are diverse culturally, linguistically, more and more ethnically, they are diverse, but there is a unity of customs, or there was for many centuries a unity of customs nonetheless. But this model of democracy, here, that's in a good sense. Usually when I use the word democracy, it's not to praise, but in the Swiss model, that's good. If the number of people or the extent of the territory is changed beyond a certain scope, the political regime is no longer adapted. That's why to talk about a democracy for the modern United States with 320 million inhabitants on one of the most vast countries on earth, in a way it doesn't function. When you can bring in people unchecked, it doesn't work. India, to say that India with 1 billion, more than 1 billion 300 million inhabitants is a democracy, it cannot be, for structural reason, for questions of measure beyond a certain limit. To talk about democracy, it's completely it doesn't work. And here a remark that Hegel makes about ancient Rome: when the Republican Rome started to expand by conquering first the Latium, then the Italian peninsula, and then eventually the whole of the Mediterranean world, the increase in size of the Republican Empire brought about inherent structural problems, because there was a disconnect between the size of the Senate and the size of the city of Rome and its immediate surroundings, and the gigantic extent of the empire. And the aristocrat, the Senate, the patricians, they could no longer rule a vastly, greatly improved territory which had been gained through military success caused by Roman virtue and discipline and organization. So they were a victim of their own success, because they were so successful at organizing their military and their city in the early centuries, that they ended up conquering all their opponents. But then they found themselves in a situation where the non-Roman citizens wanted equality. And then the Senate, no matter how competent and virtuous and exceptional the Roman aristocracy was, the territory was simply too vast. That's what it brought about ambition among the senators, then the civil conflicts with Marius, what's his name? Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, etc. Ambitious, powerful senators who wanted to impose their own domination over the Senate and eventually over the Republic, which would become an empire. So it can be interpreted this way: the change of measure, the extension of the Roman territory due to the success in military conquest of the Roman military, brought about eventually political changes in the structure. I mean, the loss of influence of the Senate, the Republican aristocratic Senate, for an imperium, an imperial Senate, and with more and more power to the emperor, and then all the problems that he brought in terms of some dubious emperors individually, one might say. So yeah, and then later in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, the decline and the fall of the empire eventually. But yeah, a change of measure brings about a qualitative change in terms of political organization. That's why the American Constitution, of course, it's great, but it was designed for a virtuous people. It means that the people have to become virtuous again, or to remain virtuous, those who still are, in order to preserve the Constitution. Here, that's the logical distinction between the form and the content. The American Constitution, the spirit, is great in its form, but it has to be filled with a content. There has to be a citizenry for which the ideals resonate. It's not just a piece of paper. And here I will talk about morality and ethics. I haven't thought this through, but the distinction that I would make spontaneously between morality and ethics: morality deals more with introspection, whereas ethics is more towards civic life. Morality is more personal, ethics is more collective. Morality, especially in a religious sense, is a relationship to the creator, whereas ethics is a relationship to the community. Morality, I associate this more with Christianity, ethics with ancient Greece and Rome, which were pagan. Morality deals with guilt, personal guilt, remorse, and inner torment, whereas ethics deals more about shame, dishonor, and ostracization. Namely, morality is personal negative relationship to oneself, whereas ethics, what matters most is not the inner, but the relationship to the community in a way. So that would be the distinction. That's why the Greeks and the Romans, that's partly a Nietzschean view, but actually it's kind of relevant. They had no guilt or remorse, or they did not experience inner torment the way Christians, later Christian Europe would. I'm not sure that the Romans or the ancient Greek felt guilty or felt remorse or inner torment, maybe sometimes because there are human universals, but guilt and remorse and inner torment, these are Christian, Nietzsche would say Christian poisons, but the Romans and the Greeks, because they were a highly civic, collective, not collectivist, but collective people in a way, in a good sense, the relationship to the community was very important. The notions of shame and dishonor and ostracism were very important. To dishonor a Greek citizen, it could be done by ostracizing him. To be rejected by the city was a very severe form of punishment, because here I will speak like Hegel. The Greeks, the ancient Greek, they had their spiritual substance in the life of the community. So to separate, to ostracize, that's where the word ostracism comes from. Namely, when the Greek city like Athens, they decided to banish, to reject, to ostracize an individual which had perpetrated a fault against the city, that was a form of punishment, ostracism, namely to refuse him access to the city, to send him away as a punishment. Yeah, so the question of honor and status, the fame, not in a sense of popularity, but the fama, which gave the word fame. To be famous, for the Romans, it didn't mean to be popular and to be widely. It didn't mean to be famous, it means to have a social reputation. But eventually, if you acquired a social reputation, you became, in a way, famous, but the fama was not a quantitative number of followers, but the value that others granted you, the way you were acknowledged by others, by your deeds or your nobility, your acts of bravery for the city, or your bloodline, or your connections with the important people, the way you helped the clients, if you were a patrician, etc. So the social reputation, in a way, that's the fama, for the which gave the word fame in English, fameux in French, which means it means more prestigious. Yes, so the prestige. And honor and reputation, civic reputation for the Romans and the Greeks was very important. And Christianity brought about a more personal relationship between the individual and an entity and vision called God, sometimes with the mediation of the church, but actually that's the criticism that already Hegel made, and then later the anti-Christian political thinkers, when I say that they made about Christianity, is that it separated the individual from his community, because precisely it put an emphasis onto the relationship between the individual and the universal, which would be God, without the mediation of the particular, which would be the community. That's the criticism that the pagan, here it means non-Christian or sometimes anti-Christian political thinkers have blamed on Christianity, and it's partly relevant. Yeah. So that's the distinction between a harmonious social totality, an organic community, versus the rule of an abstract law that would be the Abrahamic religions, in a way. But then it's not as simple, because precisely the abstract law requires the mediation of an intermediary, the priests, the imams, the rabbis, etc. But actually in Christian Europe, this is the church, which replaced, in a way, the harmonious, organic, social totality. Yeah, I simplify. The Greeks, they also had their priests, but there was less transcendence, it was more immanent, in a way. I simplify, but that's what is so appealing, what has been so appealing to many political thinkers in the history of Europe with the Greeks and the Romans, is that they had an ethical life. The spirit of these people was living in the community. The laws, the ethical behavior, the forms of art, the interactions, that's the appeal exercised by ancient Greece on the young Hegel, but on the Romantics as well, etc., etc. And I wrote, so that's a question, is the objectivization of morality into law, namely the inner determination of the soul and the consciousness of what is right and wrong, good and evil, the value, the judgments of value, when they go beyond the singular inner personal experience and they are objectified or objectivized in a law which is valid for all or ought to be valid for all. That's the transition from morality to law. An ethics would be the practicing of the customs, the virtue and the customs of the people, but here I'm talking about an abstract law. So is the objectivization of morality, the fact that what is right and wrong in society is not only experienced innerly, but is made manifest in objective spirits, in written laws, is it a progress? Hegel would say yes. The Romantics would say no, precisely because the Romantics, they had the illusion that the primitive noble savages, here it's not derogatory, the primitives didn't need a written law, but not because, that's the myth of the noble savage, not because they were primitive, but precisely because they were so good, so virtuous, that's the illusion that they had, that they didn't need a written law, because they embodied an ethical behavior, and they actualized in their behavior their traditions and their customs. That's the Romantic view of an organic totality, where there is no need for too many written, abstract, impersonal laws, because the people, when they are living as an organic community, they spontaneously act ethically. Yeah. The noble savages of the American continent before the discovery of by Europeans, some of them were thought to be noble savages, to live harmoniously, etc., or in the Pacific Islands, or the Germans before the Roman conquest, as depicted by Tacitus, they are an example, a shining example of collective virtue. The Germans, they didn't have a very complex impersonal institutional settings with written law, courts, complex impersonal institutions, because usually they lived in tiny communities, but they were very virtuous, but their laws, precisely because they hadn't reached a very developed division of labor, they hadn't developed a civilization. They had a culture, but they hadn't developed a very complex civilization with institutions, very complex infrastructures, a very broadened division of labor, etc. So they didn't have the same complexity of legislation as the Romans and the Greeks before them had, or the Middle Eastern population in Sumer, Assyria, Babylon, etc., etc. And I wrote history, that's here at the Hegelian perspective, but actually it can be more or less verified, is the process of the institutionalization and universalization of morality and ethics. For instance, the human rights, it's in a way an extension, a continuation of the theory of natural rights, natural law, which, as far as I know here, I'm not sure, but it dates from the modern theory dates from the 17th century, I would say, with Grotius, who was a Dutch geopolitical thinker. As far as I know here, I'm not very knowledgeable, but it's in the continuity, namely, actually it's in the continuity of Christian theology, the idea that every human is born with inherent rights. The early Christians, they didn't talk about rights, they talk about a soul, but then eventually, precisely, the idea that all humans are equal before God, that's the Christian view, it developed in the realm of institutions into the human rights ideology. Today, the people who defend the human rights ideology, they wouldn't say that all humans possess a soul, that's why they have to be equalized legislatively. They say that they have natural rights and an inherent dignity, so that's a Christian view. Although a lot of people are either atheist or Jewish or socialist or materialist, but actually it's a Christian view. So the ethical life, in a way, of a people constitute the vital substance of a people, the vital spiritual substance of a people. The spirit of a people is made present through its institutions, its ethical behavior, its language, its art forms, etc., its religion. And an abstract law can become ossified, in a way. When I wrote the legislativization, I'm not sure that it's an English word, but by legislativization, I mean the fact that human interaction within society are more and more regulated by abstract law, by the bureaucracy, lawyers, laws, judges, intermediaries, etc. It can be a sign, a symptom of ethical degeneracy. Precisely because the loss of what I have called civic virtue has to be compensated by an increase in bureaucracy, and reciprocally an increase in bureaucracy leads to a decrease in ethical civic virtue, because if the bureaucracy takes care of everything, people become more and more egotistical and selfish, not because they are ill-intentioned, but because the institutional setting encourages them not to care about their fellow men in society, in their own society. That's why an increase in legislation and bureaucracy can lead, and often leads to, social or ethical degeneracy. And this is what a lot of modern Westerners suffer from, although they are not capable of maybe expressing this as such, but that's what a lot of Westerners feel vaguely, that what they call individualism, actually no, it's not individualism, it's selfishness and egotism, but it's not caused because it's not because people are worse psychologically or because they are bad psychologically. Here, that's a non-judgmental view. It's simply because the growth of the welfare state and what I call the legislativization, I mean the incredible increase in legislation about everything is regulated by law, and less interactions are regulated by customs and traditions, because here that's a Marxist, vaguely Marxist analysis, because the increase in the productive forces that has enabled the development of technology, has enabled more transportation, more movement, so people are less tied to their native surroundings and native settings, so they have less moral obligation towards their immediate community, because the interactions from an economic standpoint, they can occur with people all over the world very fast through the movement of capital, investment, or simply through transportation. People who have the skills, they can travel much more easily and become successful in many regions of the same country, or different countries or different continents, etc. You can become successful in Asia if you have skills in a set of competence, which is a set of skills which is in high demand in the market. You can work on your computer in Asia, in Northern America, you can travel, etc. So it brings about, in a way, a dissolution of the classical stable settings of society, and here that's a class division. The very intelligent people who are connected to globalization, successfully connected to globalization, they tend to have a cosmopolitan ideology, and the people who are less successful economically, they tend to be less mobile and more tied to their native land of birth, and they tend to have a more conservative, populist ideology. And there is a divide in most Western countries between the liberal elites of the cosmopolitan era, which have a cosmopolitan mindset, and the native population living in the more rural areas, either in England, that's in the north, or in France, around Paris, far from the city center like Paris, Lyon, etc. It can be northern France, but also southern France or western, etc. In the US, the liberal centers, this is the East Coast and the West Coast, and in the middle, Main Street, as they call this, classical America, there is a disconnect which is partly tied to intelligence, not only, but partly tied to economic success, partly tied to education, a difference in ideology produced by the different living conditions. And the liberal elites of the city centers, London, Paris, New York, Los Angeles, etc., they impose their ideology onto the rest of the country, and the people, when they revolt against this, they are accused of being populist, reactionary, racist, xenophobic, etc., etc. But precisely the successful, mobile, cosmopolitan people, they don't want to be constrained by the requirements of an ethical life. That's why historically they have been bourgeois as opposed to the traditional religious societies. But actually in the modern world, the people here, I did not plan this, but I understand actually, the leftist liberal, they tend to compensate their lack of civic virtue, because these are people who live with people of their own kind in their city centers, people with the same ideology, the same worldview, and they interact. Sometimes they do not interact a lot with their own native population, successful white liberal of the city centers. A lot of them do not interact a lot with the working class of their own native country, and they tend, consciously or unconsciously, to compensate this lack of ethical virtue by an increase in bureaucratic legislation. That's why they are in favor of the welfare state, redistribution, help for the minorities, the poor, the sexual minorities, the migrants, etc. So they use the coercive power of the state to impose their own morality onto the whole of society. That's the origin of a lot of, I wouldn't say evil, but a lot of negative consequences of leftist behavior. There are a lot of people in show business, artists, sportsmen, cinema, etc. They really have a leftist ideology because it enables, here that's an intelligent Marxist analysis, it enables them to feel good about themselves when they care about the migrants, the women, feminism, the transgender. because they feel bad about their privileged status of being successful, etc., etc. So in a way they try to compensate, but they do not help those that they are supposed to help, namely their own native population. They help, they want to take side with what they envision to be the oppressed, but what they don't see is that economically the people who are oppressed in the modern West, these are the rural, native, working class population, because an oppressive bureaucracy, an oppressive legislation is imposed onto them by their own kin, their own people, the leftist liberals who are dominant, the dominant bourgeoisie who dominates the media, academia, the art, etc. They try to compensate in a way their own class dominance by having a cosmopolitan humanitarian view, but they do not help. Of course they don't, because here that's a class struggle analysis. They do not help their own working class. Yeah. So they dress themselves in the clothes of the good guys because they have a universalist cosmopolitan view, how we have to help everyone. But actually, the consequences of the policies that they implement, their welfare policies, their regulations, their political correctness, their tolerance, etc., it's done with the money of others, and it's forcefully imposed into the whole of society. And this is the root of a lot of social, economic, and political conflict between the urbanized centers and the rural populations. Yeah. I could be a great sociologist if I dedicated myself to sociology. Yeah, but in this video I wanted to talk about chemistry. So here's what I could say. It's difficult. It's difficult. I will stop the video here and I will continue working. I will continue working.